48 hours? That's the distance between a head of state and a criminal defendant, between a presidential compound in Caracas and a courtroom in New York. I'm Caitlin Collins, and what you're watching right now isn't just the arrest of Nicolás Maduro. It's a collision between law and sovereignty, one that could quietly rewrite the rules of global power. U.S. prosecutors say this case is simple: cocaine trafficking, terrorist-linked cartels, corruption hidden inside a government. Maduro says it's something else entirely, an act of force, dressed up as justice. His lawyer calls him immune. Legal scholars call the operation a violation of international law. And yet, here he is, pleading not guilty under U.S. law. So here's the question no one can avoid. If this prosecution is legitimate, no leader is untouchable. And if it isn't, what does that say about the world order we're living in? If you want to understand how this moment became possible, stay with me. Because to judge the outcome, we first have to understand the charge itself. This case isn't just about who Nicolás Maduro is. It's about what the United States says he represents. At its core, prosecutors are making a sweeping claim that the Venezuelan state itself was turned into a mechanism for crime, not a rogue official, not a hidden network operating in the shadows, but a system allegedly led from the very top, designed to move cocaine into the United States while shielding those responsible from consequences. The charges lay out 4 central accusations: a narco-trafficking conspiracy, collaboration with groups the US now labels terrorist organizations, the use of illegal weapons to protect that operation, and the abuse of public office to make it all possible. This isn't framed as corruption on the margins. It's framed as governance as a criminal enterprise. Maduro rejects that framing entirely. He says, this is not law enforcement, it's geopolitics. Oil, influence, punishment for defiance. His defense argues that a sovereign leader cannot be tried this way, and that how he arrived in New York matters as much as why. That tension between criminal law and global power is what defines everything that comes next. Because to understand how prosecutors built this case, we have to go back to where they say it all began. Prosecutors say this story doesn't begin with a raid or an indictment. It begins in 1999. That's when Nicolás Maduro first entered public office, at a moment when Venezuela was reshaping its political identity. Institutions were being rebuilt. Power was being centralized. And according to the US indictment, those shifts created opportunity not just for politics, but for something far darker. The allegation is gradual, almost cyclical. As authority consolidated, oversight weakened. As loyalty became currency, access followed. Prosecutors claim that early on, Maduro used his position to provide passports and diplomatic cover to drug traffickers' mechanisms that allowed illegal operations to move under the protection of the state. Then came 2013, Maduro became president, and the indictment describes a turning point. What prosecutors say had existed on the margins was now allowed to expand. Drug trafficking, they argue, didn't just survive under his rule, it flourished. Not by accident, but because the system no longer resisted it. This is how the US frames the case. Not a sudden crime, but a long-built structure. One that grew quietly until it became impossible to separate power from profit. And that framing sets up the first real rupture when allegations turned into open confrontation. The first rupture comes when names become public and power starts to fracture. US prosecutors don't just accuse Nicolás Maduro. They widen the circle. His wife, his son, senior officials who controlled Venezuela's police forces, and an alleged gang leader tied to one of the most feared criminal organizations in the region. What had been a long-running investigation suddenly becomes a direct challenge to an entire ruling structure. This is where the case stops being abstract. The indictment claims that state resources were allegedly used to protect massive cocaine shipments moving through Venezuela, bound for Mexico and ultimately the United States. Law enforcement, prosecutors argue, wasn't just compromised, it was repurposed. Protection became policy. The US response escalates fast. Rewards are offered for arrests. Charges pile up. And after the raid, one of the accused appears on Venezuelan television, urging calm and loyalty, telling citizens to trust their leaders and their military. It's a moment that reveals how fragile control can look when it's publicly questioned. If you're trying to understand how a legal case turns into a geopolitical flashpoint, this is it. Because once allegations reach this level, they stop being about guilt alone. And that's where the hidden mechanics of this system come into focus. What prosecutors describe next is not chaos, it's structure. According to the indictment, this operation didn't rely on secrecy alone. It relied on control. Control over borders, over police forces, over who gets stopped and who gets waved through. The accusation is that drug shipments moved because the state itself provided cover, logistics, and protection, fully aware those drugs were headed to the United States. The alleged partnerships matter here. Prosecutors say the defendants worked with groups the U.S. now designates as terrorist organizations, the FARC, the Sinaloa and Zetas cartels, and Tren de Aragua, not as outsiders. As collaborators, the mechanism, they argue, was simple but powerful. In exchange for bribes and loyalty, traffickers received safe passage, intelligence, and immunity. Before becoming president, Maduro is accused of enabling these systems through documents and diplomatic privileges. After taking office, prosecutors claim he allowed the trade to expand for his benefit, for his inner circle, and for his family. Violence, they allege, enforced discipline, kidnappings, beatings, murders, not random acts, but tools of control. This is the core of the US case, that what looks like corruption is actually governance redesigned for profit. And once a system like that exists, it doesn't stay contained. It accelerates toward another breaking point. The second crisis isn't quieter, it's sharper, faster, more personal. This is where prosecutors focus on movement planes, containers, ports, and routes that stretch from Venezuela to Miami and New York. They allege Maduro's son, Nicolás Ernesto Maduro Guerra, became an active node inside the system. Regular flights to Margarita Island, packages military officials believed contained drugs, conversations about quality, pricing, and destinations. According to the indictment, this wasn't amateur trafficking. It was operational detail. Hundreds of kilograms of cocaine, shipments calibrated by market, low-quality product diverted to New York because it couldn't be sold in Miami. Cargo containers unloaded near ports, scrap metal used as cover. This is the moment where the case narrows from theory to logistics. And it's also where rhetoric explodes. Maduro Guerra publicly condemns the US operation as a threat to global stability. He warns that if the kidnapping of a head of state becomes normal, no country is safe. That warning matters because it reframes the crisis. What prosecutors call evidence, the accused call escalation, and now the consequences are no longer abstract. They start landing on ordinary people. This is where the story stops being about court filings and starts being about you. Because when prosecutors talk about tons of cocaine moving through protected routes, they're not describing an abstract crime. They're describing consequences that ripple outward. Addiction, violence, communities destabilized far beyond Venezuela's borders, and inside Venezuela, a different cost. Institutions hollowed out, trust eroded, fear normalized. If you're a Venezuelan citizen, this case doesn't feel theoretical. It's about living under a system where power and protection are blurred, where loyalty determines safety, and where the line between state and criminal force is no longer clear. If you're outside the country, you're still connected through drugs on the street, through migration pressures, through a global system that doesn't stop at borders. This is why the accusations matter, even before a verdict. Because if leaders can allegedly weaponize the state for personal gain, the damage isn't confined to one family or one administration. It spreads quietly, relentlessly. If this story feels heavy, it should. And if you want accountability to mean something, this is the moment to pay attention. Because what happens next doesn't just shape Venezuela. It reshapes the world around it. Beyond Venezuela, the impact widens and it moves fast. Because this case doesn't sit neatly inside one courtroom or one country. It touches Colombia, Mexico, the United States, and any nation watching how power is enforced across borders. Prosecutors accuse the defendants of working with armed groups and cartels that operate transnationally, creating a web that links insurgency, organized crime, and state authority into a single chain. That matters geopolitically. When the US designates groups like the FARC, major Mexican cartels, and Tren de Aragua as terrorist organizations, it changes the stakes. Cooperation becomes terrorism. Trafficking becomes national security. And a criminal case becomes a signal about who the US believes is beyond the bounds of legitimate governance. At the same time, legal experts warn that how Maduro was brought to New York may reverberate just as loudly. If the seizure violated international law, it raises fears other countries can't ignore. Precedents don't stay local, They travel. This is why allies watch carefully and adversaries take notes. Because the question isn't just whether Maduro is guilty. It's whether the balance between sovereignty and enforcement has quietly shifted, and whether the world is ready for what comes after that shift. What happens next depends on which rulebook ultimately wins. There are 3 paths forward and none of them are clean. The first is the most straightforward. The US case holds. Evidence is accepted. The trial proceeds like any other federal prosecution. In this scenario, the message is clear: position offers no protection. Power does not equal immunity. And the United States proves it can apply its laws even at the highest levels. The second path is murkier. Legal challenges narrow the case. Classified evidence limits what the public ever sees. The trial becomes fragmented, technical, slow. Accountability exists, but it's partial. The system functions, but without clarity. And doubt lingers. The third path is the most destabilizing. International law dominates the conversation. The manner of Maduro's seizure overshadows the charges themselves. Allies push back. Adversaries respond. The case becomes less about guilt and more about legitimacy, and the global order absorbs another fracture. None of these futures is theoretical. Each one reflects a tension already visible today, and which one becomes reality won't just be decided by judges or juries. It will be shaped by how much the world is willing to accept in the name of justice. Because the ending of this story doesn't close a chapter. It opens a precedent. This case will end in a courtroom, but its meaning won't. Whether Nicolás Maduro is convicted or not, something irreversible has already happened. A line has been crossed. A sitting head of state was taken by force, put on trial, and folded into the machinery of US criminal law. That alone changes how power is measured in the modern world. Prosecutors say this is about accountability. Critics say it's about dominance. Legal experts say both can be true at the same time. And that's the reality you and I are left with, where justice and geopolitics no longer pretend to live in separate rooms. If this becomes the new normal, leaders everywhere will govern differently. Some with more caution, others with more fear, and some with the belief that rules only matter when they're enforced selectively. So the real question isn't just what happens to Maduro. It's what happens after Maduro. If you want to understand how this precedent reshapes global power, law, and leadership, stay with me. Share this. Keep watching. Because the next case may come faster than anyone expects. And when it does, the world will already know how this one began.